Here, what is a popular topic for lunch? I don't know what's wrong with you people, but this brings them in, I guess. Anyway, we're as excited as you are to hear this presentation today. My name is Jeff Sellers. I'm the Curator of Education here at the Tennessee State Museum. This is our second in our fall series of Lunch and Learns, and we're very excited about all of these, particularly the theme for this month here, and that is Nashville's more seedy history. Folks standing, we're going to get you all some seats. We got more help coming on the way to help set chairs out. So just be patient with us, and we will get you guys seated as soon as we can. Okay, for today's story, learning series, we have Murder and Mayhem. And this is a walk through Nashville's crime history. Many of these stories you have never heard before. But they happen along the streets and sidewalks and street corners that we all stand on and walk across every single day. That's what's cool about this. But our guest today has pulled out some of these lesser-known people in history that have lived in the generations before us here in Nashville and have brought them out of history and given them an identity, and he'll share those stories with us. Our guest today is Brian Allison. Brian's been a good friend of mine for many, many years, and he is an exhaustive research historian. He's a local Nashville historian, does fantastic work in the field of Nashville history, and he's going to share with you these stories that are exclusive only to him, that he has dug up.
Mentioned the City Cemetery were based on him.
He will be, and yeah, I'll be remiss not to point out that next weekend, we will be doing he will be at the Living Histories Tour.
This Sunday.
Okay, sorry.
Saturday.
Saturday.
Everybody's on.
Saturday, it will be at the Nashville City Cemetery. It will benefit the Nashville City Cemetery Association. Okay, so check online for that and go see some of these characters in person.
Sunday he's doing a talk also at the book festival, so come to that.
Thank you, Jim. All right. I'm going to hand it over to you now, Brian, and thank you for joining us. And let's all give Brian a warm welcome.
I want to thank you all for coming out. I didn't know there was this many twisted people that work for the state. This is awesome. Give yourselves a hand, all right? Well, as Jeff said in that very kind introduction, this has been kind of I don't know if labor of love is exactly the word for it, but it's been a long road to get to this point, to write this book. It wasn't a book that I set out to write either. As he said, I'm a research historian. I've worked at several different sites and jobs over the last few years. And usually the research, as you well know, is oftentimes boring and tedious. And, it's like they say, there's lies, there's damn lies, and then there's statistics. And that's what a lot of it is. But every once in a while, you come across that newspaper article, and you go, what? That didn't happen here, did that? That's a great story. But what do I do with it? So I just started keeping a file of weird stories, not all crime, but, just odd happenings, little odd human interest stories. And I started a newspaper morgue. And the next thing you know, and when I'd get some time to look into it, I'd look a little further and I'd start developing these stories. I talked to the History Press last year, and this is not my title, this is their title. They have a series called Murder and Mayhem in Nashville, or Murder and Mayhem. And they said nobody had written a Nashville book, which I found surprising. And after talking to a lot of people about this topic, I now know why. We keep our secrets well in this town, and a lot of people, we're going to be talking about stories here that we don't talk about. I ran into a lot of that when I was growing up. We don't talk about that. Well, I know why now, but I think it's about time we do talk about some of it, because we don't have a past that's as shocking, I think, as Chicago or New York or anything like that, but there's some very interesting stories that have been spawned in these streets. By the way, we are a city. Is it going to work? Let's see. Oh, it worked. There you go. Right there. That was the first big shock I got writing this book, is when I was doing the introduction and looked up the population of Nashville. We are bigger than Boston, as one of my friends would say. Officially in 2015, population of Nashville is 678,889. Boston comes in at 667,137. So we are a major city, which I still find when I'm doing tours shocks people. What's that? Oh, was there a... Oh, okay. I thought somebody was going to shout out to Boston. Right on. There you go. Go Celtics. But when you get down to it, you still get that sense when people come to this city. One of my friends had a tour not too long ago where she said one of the comments by one of the folks touring the downtown was, "This is a real city." Yeah, I mean, they're expecting, I think, cow pens and farms still. You know, Nashville's been a real city for a long time. It's a city with humble roots. I think this is what they're expecting when they come here. This is Nashville at the time I'm writing about. By the way, the book covers everything from about 1790 up to about 1940. It's kind of just a catch-all of interesting stories, the ones I could really develop and work with. By the way, the population of the town at that time was 5,566, and if you want to know what kind of town Nashville was at that point, when a man was killed in the city in 1839, it made the papers as the first homicide the city had had in 6 years. So things have changed quite a bit over the last few decades. But why did I write the book is a big question a lot of people ask, and it's not to glorify crime, it's not to get vicarious thrill out of it. A lot of this is detective work. We all hear about every day Andy Jackson and Andy Johnson and James K. Polk and the big names. But if you want to see the underside of their world, if you want to see life as it was, I don't think you can get a more raw and more visual experience than go through the criminal records. Those are the records that people did not want to remember in a lot of ways. And they are a window on these hidden stories. Whoa, why are we doing that? Why are we doing that? Let's go back. Thank you. These windows on these stories, these hidden lives, people who lived in the shadow of this city. So in a way, it was this wonderful way to touch on this past. One of the things I always found as a challenge was trying to get people to realize that they're not cardboard cutouts. Whatever problems you, your family, your friends, or just generally dingy people in society today have, we're human beings. Those problems go back several thousand years, and life was no different in a lot of ways in the Greek times than it is today. Nowhere is that more clear than when you start digging through these records, because you get to see them at their worst, which in a way is kind of a bridging the gap. Suddenly, they're not on pedestals any longer. Suddenly, they're human beings with all of our failings and all of our capability for kindness and cruelty. So, we're going to talk about some of these stories that I've come across, some of the more interesting ones that kind of stood out as an example of that. Okay, let's try it again. And it stays. Good. A lot of this touches on some really seedy areas of town. One of them in particular, Smoky Row, which is a legend in a lot of ways in Nashville. And usually whenever somebody would bring up Smoky Row with me in the past, it was always followed by this gesture. There's a lot of giggling about it and not a lot of details about Smoky Row. I mean, you've got a lot of statistics about it. You've got a lot of grand sweeping points to make about it. What about the lives of the people who actually live there? So it's enlightening when you come across a story like this one. This is an extreme example, by the way, Mary P. Smith. I'm not sure what to make of this story in a lot of ways. We wouldn't know anything about this young lady except the way she ended her life. And her life ended at that spot right there. October the 26th, 1853. There was a rented room. This, by the way, was the corner where the Veranda Hotel and the post office building was. That building evidently was a rental property that was right next door to the post office building. And in that rented room, young Mary P. Smith woke up that morning with her latest customer. She was one of the girls that worked the row. He apparently wanted to get on with her day and rather callously decided to kick her out and tell her to get lost and get his day started. Her response was to walk over to the corner of the room where there was a drawer in a dresser. She opened the drawer, pulled out a pistol and cocked it, and then turned to him and said, "So I suppose you're tired of me too." Put the barrel against her heart and pulled the trigger. Dead instantly. That was one of the things that made the paper, because that was a rather violent and direct way for these ladies to go out. Usually laudanum or drowning or something a little less violent was the way, so that made the paper. But what really made the papers was what came up at her inquest, and a lot of excerpts from the inquest were published in the local press. Here's probably the most detailed from the Nashville True Whig on October 26th, the day after she died. We learned that she received, in one of the best female schools in the state, located in a neighboring town, a finished education, and at the age with which young ladies generally leave the seminary, was an accomplished, handsome, and interesting girl. But, love Victorian prose, in an evil hour she departed from the path of virtue and became dishonored. About 18 months since she came to Nashville, and has ever since then been an inmate of one of the numerous houses of ill fame which infest this city. So basically, she was kicked out by her parents for acting on human nature, and had to fend her way for the next year and a half in Nashville in the mean streets of the row. Incidentally, most of the paper said she was from Murray County, so that was a very interesting statement about one of the best female schools in the state in a neighboring town. It could be this one, and if so, she was a member of the inaugural class, as you can see right there, founded 1852. That's about the time she probably would have been leaving the school. It could have also been the Columbia Female Institute. We talked about that last night with somebody at the Tennessee Historical Society. So we're still doing a lot of research on this one, I am, because I want to know who she was. Mary Smith is nothing to go on. Everybody hints that she was, oh, by the way, the Nashville City Cemetery comes into this because there's confirmation of some of this story in there. She is listed as Mary P. Smith in the cemetery records. She was put in the cooling vault on October 27, 1853, and the notation in the cemetery ledger says, "To be taken to Columbia." So apparently the family took her back too late. They did take her home. Everyone hints at this family. It was a big family. It was a prominent family. But nobody wants to actually say, obviously in the Victorian era, who it was. Only one paper made a direct accusation, and that was the Loudon Free Press from East Tennessee. It said, and this is where my jaw dropped, she was a niece of General Pillow. Not that pillow, the other pillow. Thank you, machine. You want to, okay. All right, well, imagine this is Gideon Pillow.
I was coming. That's it.
Gideon Pillow, yes, the former law partner of James K. Polk, the Mexican War goat and windbag, and later one of the most disastrous Confederate generals, if you know anything about it, with an awesome vest. I love the vest. I'd love to have one. But yeah, a niece of General Pillow. Now, I have to put this caveat in. We cannot confirm the story. I've looked at every family tree I can find. I can't identify one. A match. We've looked through some cemetery records, but I haven't had a chance to really look through the Columbia, Murray County cemetery records. I'm looking for a girl who died that day, and hopefully if we can match up a date, we might have a starting point for this. That seems to be the next logical step. But one researcher down at Columbia did make one bombshell, and it hadn't even occurred to me. It's very unusual for one of these girls to have a middle name. Mary Smith is one thing, Kate Rogers. I've run into these. See, and they were all pseudonyms, what was your name in Cincinnati, that sort of thing. She goes by Mary P. Smith. And somebody said, wait a minute, could that be Pillow? Was that a selling point? I don't know. So unfortunately, again, sometimes it raises more questions than answers, but this remarkable situation, suddenly we've got a very vivid snapshot of a tragedy involving, as the press said, an accomplished, handsome, interesting girl that I wouldn't have even known existed, except she fell afoul of the society she lived in. So that's the sort of thing that keeps you going as a researcher when you're doing this, as you come across these incredible stories. One of the more interesting ones... Okay. Aren't you glad you're live streaming this on Facebook? This is, okay. Go back. Thank you. It's the curse of Gideon Pillow, isn't it? Tell you what. I'll be back and forth for the rest of this. All right. Now, I at one time worked at Traveler's Rest, and this fellow came up quite a bit, General Thomas Overton. This is the brother of John Overton, who owned Traveler's Rest. Very interesting fellow in his own right, member of the Society of the Cincinnati. He was a veteran of Valley Forge, Washington's Army, everything else. So when he put his plantation in Old Hickory, he named it Soldier's Rest, naturally. This is all that's left of it. I got to go out there that day to take those pictures. He's buried here. And you want to talk about, this was the day before Halloween last year, I believe it was. That little dude followed me around the whole time. I am not kidding. A black cat, coal black, showed up and he's like sitting on the grave. Every time I tried to take a picture, I was like, okay, well, I'll just, yeah. And so, you talk about Halloween experiences. I had them writing this book. But Tom Overton, the story here, it doesn't involve him. It involves his plantation and the community within. And it provided a very rare glimpse into that community. It's one of the more remarkable stories I came across, and that's about Israel. Israel was one of the slaves that lived on the plantation. And we don't have a lot of details on the crime, but in October of 1819, his overseer, William O'Brien, was killed, murdered on the plantation somewhere. No details of how he died, what exactly happened. They interrogated the slaves, and they came up with a suspect, Israel, who was apparently interrogated until he confessed, and probably none too gently. So far, not a terribly unusual story for the antebellum South. Overseers naturally are not very liked people, and they were often murdered. He was tried, he was sentenced to death, nothing out of the ordinary there. But it was during his interrogation that a very remarkable turn of events happened. He named an accomplice under interrogation. Mary Ann O'Brien, the widow of the deceased. He claimed it was a put-up job, and she had put him up to it. Now, unfortunately, here's the problem is, if we had criminal records, if we had a trial transcript, if we had the Supreme Court records even, we'd have a lot more detail on this. We don't. We have the minutes of the court, and unfortunately, they're summaries. So you have to draw between the line, but luckily some documents were introduced into the court records that are a little more detailed than average. And they paint an interesting picture. Apparently Mary Ann's defense team tried to get Israel's confession quashed under the old statute that an African American cannot testify against a white person in criminal courts. That was thrown out because Israel's confession wasn't being introduced by Israel, it was being introduced by Nelson Jones, the white man who'd interrogated him, and he was allowed to testify. So they went forward with a full criminal trial, and unfortunately all we really know is she was tried and before God found not guilty, acquitted of all charges, and walked out the same day. We don't know what was said, we don't know how it was said, how it all came about. But Mary Ann went free from this. Either she was not guilty or they just did not want to hang a woman in that day and age. But it was interesting to see there's witness lists and things that actually came into the thing. So we have some names out there. Thomas Overton was called as a witness at this trial. I would love to have heard his testimony. And two of his slaves were subpoenaed and put in here, Lydia and Billy. So you can find some remarkable little details, flashes of at least genealogical value hidden in these court records. As for Israel, nothing was going to save him. He was sentenced to be executed November the 6th, 26, 1819, quote, between the hours of 12 and 2 o'clock at the forks of the road leading from Nashville, the one part going to John Buchanan's and the other to John Raines. Well, they weren't, again, that's Raines and Buchanan Station, but he wasn't executed there. He was executed where it came together near Nashville. And as Jeff said, this will make you look at some sites totally differently once you learn this. We did a little digging on this, and here it is. This is where approximately where the intersection of that road was. This is the rail yard behind the Union Station Hotel. And that's where the gallows was apparently put. It's a good bet that somewhere out here is still the body of Israel, because there's an old English tradition, and it was strong right up through the 18th century. They found archaeological examples recently of this, where the murderer should be buried at the crossroads. And so, if that held true, now I can't guarantee that. Again, that was a dying tradition in the early 19th century, but it was very interesting that that's where they put the gallows. That wasn't the normal place to put one. So it's possible that they went through the old tradition and put Israel somewhere through here. So interesting little stories that pop up out of this research. And And this is one of the more heartbreaking and heartwarming ones that I ran across. That photograph, to me, was the miracle of the book right there. This is Benjamin Franklin Dowell and his wife, Alice May Woodward, probably their wedding photo. Dowell was a police officer, Nashville PD. On December 6th, 1903, he was gunned down while he was waiting for his shift relief on Lindsley Avenue. While he was standing at that intersection there, he was approached by Tom Cox, who was a longtime troublemaker in the city. And Cox, apparently without warning, without even drawing his pistol, fired through his overcoat pocket and shot him several times. He actually got a shot off. He wounded Cox in return, but Cox got away and he didn't. Again, that whole thing of never seeing these places the same way twice. He was shot right outside this next slide, right here. That's where he was killed. The Lindsley Avenue Church of Christ, which was Grace Presbyterian at the time, the 7 o'clock service had just started, and he came literally staggering into the nave with his gun dangling from one hand and supposedly said, "Gentlemen, I've been shot. Would someone please take my pistol?" So they laid him out on a pew. They called the meat wagon. He was taken to the city hospital. He died 2 days later. Cox tried to claim self-defense at the trial. It's a little bit about Cox. He was mobbed up, I think is the modern parlance for it. He became a symbol in this thing. If you know anything about turn of the century Nashville, the Demon Rum and the Reformers were at war with each other, and this became a showpiece trial. Cox he had to have been protected. He had already killed one guy before. He was in and out of court for assault, robbery, knifings, you name it, and somehow was still walking the streets. And you get the picture of a fellow who's probably being used as an enforcer by the saloon interests in Black Bottom at that point in time. Just as an example, Cox had shot a guy in a fight not long earlier. I believe he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Before it even went to appeal, he was given executive clemency by the governor. I mean, he didn't even spend a day other than the time he was in jail for waiting for his trial. That was about it. So Cox was a bad boy. But it was these images of the lives that were touched by these tragedies that really struck me. I always try to find sympathy for these guys if I can. You know, it's hard with someone. Cox is a hard one to find sympathy for. Dowell was easier. That picture that I got right there, I was so lucky. There was a lady on Ancestry who had posted that. And I wrote her, I just said, "Can you use that?" And I looked at her account, it was like inactive for 6 months. I was like, she's never going to get that. Literally the day before the deadline showed up for my images, she wrote me out of the blue and said, "I would be so honored if you would include that." She said, and tells me all these family stories about Dowell and what happened to the widow afterwards. She just barely remembered, I think, Alice's daughter was her grandmother, I believe. So it was this incredible moment and this beautiful, touching image of those two. You go through the newspapers and you come up with these heartwarming stories in a lot of ways. Dowell comes across as an honest cop and a good one. He was tough. I mean, he made several one-handed collars, wading into saloons with nightsticks and that sort of thing. But my favorite story that came out was the one in Centennial Park on one hot August day. He was on duty out there, and these two African-American kids, I think they were about 9 or 10 years old, stripped down completely naked and climbed to one of the fountains to cool off. And of course, they called the cop, and the cop was Dowell, and he showed up, and of course, they saw the blue uniform and the shield, they took off running. So he is literally running through these very well-dressed people with these two naked kids, and he's trying to, so this chase went on, but then he's pouring sweat. It's an August day. He finally literally went, "Truce, come in." So the kids came over, and he turned to him and he said, "Guys, do you understand you can't do that? You cannot strip naked. It's not done." So he said, "I'll make you a deal. Go back and get your clothes and go home. I won't run you in. I won't even call your parents. Just go." And so the kids, "Yes, sir," and they took their stuff and they went. I mean, that's a good cop thinking on his feet. I'm making it worse by running these two naked kids through the crowd. Let's just go home. It's not worth the chase at this point. And it made the papers. And then he ends up dead. Cox is hard to come up with any kind of sympathy for. But I can find some, and I think the biggest and the key to this whole crime comes to his devotion to family. Cox is Irish, and family comes first. He was especially devoted to Nellie, his sister. Here's a little known piece of info. One of the few times Cox played the hero. In 1897, he was arrested for assault and run in because Madam Jessie Shrivers, who ran a house on Line Street, accused him of pistol whipping her. So he tried to force his way into her house and he tried to break her hand with his pistol. Well, the cop who arrested him said he didn't have a gun, which was extremely unusual. I think Cox probably palmed it to somebody else. But in court, he testified as to why he invaded the house in the first place. His sister Nellie, who was 20, had run away from the family recently, and she'd taken shelter in Jesse Schreiber's brothel, and Jesse wouldn't let her leave. She got a load out to Tom, and Tom came kicking the door in and basically said, "You're not touching my sister again," and let her go home. In fact, in court, the judge gave a lecture to Jesse Schreiber's and said, "I don't see any reason to sustain these charges." And he told Schreiber's from the bench, "If you catch Nellie Cox around your face again," he said, "I'm going to run you in. You keep her away from that house." I mean, the man had a noble streak under all that mean. And in fact, what touched this off was a complaint that Nellie made. Nellie had been arrested by Officer Dowell earlier that day. She was violating, her husband ran a grocery/saloon, and she was violating the Sunday laws. So she blessed him out on the way to the police station and called him every name in the book. When Cox came out to bail his sister out, she told Cox that Officer Dowell had slapped her around and roughed her up. And his response was to go berserk. Cox basically told her at the police station, "Well, don't worry about this, I'll fix it." And he walked out. They said even Nellie looked nervous at what Tom had in mind. And the other thing you can say in Tom's defense is his death was nothing you'd wish on your worst enemy. I don't know what red oxide of mercury is. Just stay away from it, if anybody offers you it. He was sentenced to hang. They had to fix it. It's all in the book. If you get it, it's incredible how blatant the corruption was and how they tried to have perjury and all sorts of things going on in this trial. They still found him guilty, and this time no executive clemency. He was sentenced to hang. A couple of days before he hanged, they found him sick in his cell, and it turned out he had taken this red oxide of mercury and swallowed it. He'd smuggled it in somehow. They never did find out how he got it in. A couple of days later, he died in awful pain with his mother at his bedside, to the point that one of the last statements he ever made was, "It would have been easier if I'd just hanged." So Cox is a sad case in his own right. I wouldn't wish that on anybody. And the big mystery on Cox is, how did he end up where he is? By the way, he wasn't a very good Catholic in life. He had at least 1 or 2 murders, several assaults. He was divorced. He committed suicide 2 days before he was supposed to hang. He's buried in Calvary Cemetery. And I read that by my Irish Catholic mother, and she wrote. And he was also refused just extreme unction on the deathbed. The priest wouldn't come out to give him the last rites. So how he pulled that off, I don't know. But Cox ended up embracing the religion that he'd turned his back on in life. Well, those are some of the forgotten lives. And the next thing on this list is forgotten places. I didn't intend this to look like the Haunted Mansion from Disney World, but I'm so glad that came out the way it did. There's the public square, a very early photo, probably 1855, because the courthouse burned in 56, so that's probably about that time up there. And it was amazing to see how much mayhem is associated with the public square. It's working again. Okay, I'm going to try it. Public Square Park here. This is, if you've seen the series Nashville, this is your version of Public Square, and most people's version. After the urban blight of the 1960s through the 80s, it looks a lot better today than it ever did in its past. It's a lot calmer now than it ever was in its past, and especially from that period from 1830 to 1860, let's say. You're going to try it again, are you? Here's a little bit of what I uncovered. A lot of this didn't make it into the book. You can see right here, just walking around the square, starting at an early date with Andy Jackson down here in 1813, at least 2 shootings in the Nashville Inn, 4 in Bell's Exchange, 3 shootings and a stabbing. Bell's Exchange was a nice restaurant. It was a very upscale place, but it was a bucket of blood. Everybody that had a problem apparently settled it right there. Ned Buntline, the famous author and journalist. I wouldn't go so far as to. He's a dime novelist. He was nearly hanged by a mob after shooting the husband of a man that he was having an affair, a husband of a woman he was having an affair with. That's all in the book too. So, but basically, here's a little bit of that. I grew up reading Dodge City and Tombstone and never realizing that just 20 years earlier, my hometown was host to quite a bit of this mayhem that we just don't talk about. By the way, there's the original jail. Some of you historian types might be interested in this. I found a write-up on the original jail when it was built in 1852. Right there at that spot, they said, on the on the exact spot once occupied by Fort Nashboro in 1780, which is several blocks north of the rebuilt one in the 1830s. So I thought that was fascinating there. But so interesting little things that came to light researching this. Here's one in detail just to give you an idea. Nashville Inn, the reason I love this is because it involves this print, which I've grown up looking at, and a lot of people have on their walls in this town. And again, changes the way you look at this nice hostelry here. It's the story of Gideon Matlock, who was a Carthage man, and it seems to have been a fairly calm sort. But on July 19th, 1843, he killed a guy in here. And the cause seems to have been James K. Polk's politics. Matlock was a Polk man. And when Governor Lean Jimmy Jones accused him of lying in print about Jones's record, Matlock wrote a blistering reply back basically saying, you know you're lying when you call me a liar. You don't ever say that to a Southern gentleman at the time. He also said essentially that if you were a man, you'd challenge me, but I don't think you will. Well, Jones did what any good politician should do. He ignored it. It was just politic talk. It was election year, so he was not worried about that. However, Jesse A. Bryan did worry about that. Jesse was from Clarksville. He was a neighbor of old Lean Jimmy Jones and a friend of his. And he started stalking Matlock, make him take it back or fight or run. Well, he had a novel way of doing it. He told people, he got some pills. And he told people he was going to force Matlock at gunpoint to swallow these pills. A weird thing to say, at the least. Well, when you read between the lines, you know what he's talking about eventually. It's the pills were laxatives. Because at one point he charmingly said that he was going to, quote, work the Polk juice out of Matlock. I love, again, you see them at their worst. I was like, oh my God. Now his friends reacted very sensibly. They said, no man, don't do that. Okay, so everything comes to a head here. By the way, Bryan had already killed a guy in Clarksville very publicly with a Bowie knife, so he was a bad dude. Matlock was trying to avoid him. He had moved all his baggage out here into this building. Here's the general stage office, and he had decided it was time to go back to Carthage. So he was trying to dodge Matlock or Bryan as much as possible. He forgot his wallet. He left it at the bar, and he had to go back to get the wallet. And just as he stepped up there, that's when Jesse Bryan shouldered his way to the bar and asked, "Where's this kid Matlock guy? I'm looking for him." They went into the next room, and I have to hand it to Matlock. He did his best to avoid trouble, even when he called him a damned liar and tried to knock his hat off his head. Doesn't sound like grown-up behavior. Matlock basically put his hand in his pocket and he said, "You stay away from me," and he backed out of the room. When they got into the public room in front of 100 witnesses, that's when Bryan put his hand in his pocket, and Matlock came out with his pistol, shot him through the heart. One shot, and they said he staggered around, fired into the floor, and he dropped dead. Interestingly enough, Matlock was not arrested in Carthage, where he was from. He was arrested in Columbia, who was whose hometown? James K. Polk. And a few years later, he was acquitted. By the way, the circuit court in Davidson County held that these are deadly weapons. If A tries to force B to swallow pills at gunpoint, B is within his rights to shoot him. So if anybody tries to make you take that aspirin, there is a precedent in the legal system that you can kill them. Didn't quite work out that way, but he ended up serving as a sub-agent of the Indian Bureau under President James K. Polk. And boy, the press is full of snide comments about how Polk is firing duelists from the military, and yet he's hiring this guy as an Indian agent. To his credit, he served honorably and well, and that's why Gideon Matlock is now buried in Council Bluffs, Iowa, of all places. He died in 1856 while he's still on the job. Now, let's see, are you going to do it to me or what? Would you mind? Thank you. We're going to give up on this thing. Now, here's one of my favorite lost places in Nashville, and it's the scene of a tragedy that this book helped me put a lot of loose ends to. It's in the papers, if you look at it, late in 1861, just as the war was starting. And it does not involve Mrs. Polk. This was her residence at the time. If you know Polk Place, this was supposed to be her husband's retirement home, but he died 49 days into it, and she lived there till the 1890s. The death actually involves what they euphemistically called the servant family back in those days. And all they say in the papers is a Negro woman, a colored servant, the usual euphemisms for one of the slaves in the family. It's a tragic story. Just to sum it up, one of the servants in the household, one of the slaves in the household, fell ill. And I've talked to medical people. It's 19th century medicine. You can't tell what happened, but one of them had a plausible theory that it was probably encephalitis or high fever. Something affected her mind because they said her behavior was altered when the fever broke. And to the point that the family and the other slaves in the house were told to keep an eye on her. At one point, she got out of the room she was being treated in, and one of the slaves actually had to almost force her back into the room and tell her to go lay down, you're sick and you don't need to be up. Sometime after that, they turned them back just a little bit, and when they came back a few minutes later, I guess, she was lying at the top of the stairs with her throat cut from ear to ear. She'd gotten a hold of a knife, and she'd done it. Worst was yet to come because they pulled her into the room to try to save her life and called the doctor, and that's when they found her 3 children. She killed all of them. When the only defense she could give in her state was when they asked her, she said, "I'm sorry, but I couldn't help it." Mental illness is like that. They said that she was not expected to live. The children would be buried that day. And once again, the city cemetery records came to those impartial records. They don't care about your race. They don't care about anything. They're statistics. And that's what's wonderful about them. Because of that, on that day, November the 16th, I believe it was, November 15th, 1861, you come across those 2, not 3, interestingly enough, but 2 infant, colored, buried in the Negro lot, as they called it in those days. Infant, colored. 2 of them. And then the next day, Susan, age 27, colored. And the heartbreaking entry, buried in grave with children. Suicide. We have her name again, finally. After all these years, and if it wasn't for the cemetery records, that never would have, none of the papers even mention a name. It's just a colored servant. So another little tragedy that helps to humanize a very inhumanizing system and bring another little story out from the shadows on that. Some of these are extremely unlikely, though. Go ahead. This, by the way, is where she's buried and where that tour will be on Saturday, the 15th. There's crass commercialism all around here, people. But I'll be there, Jim will be there, so he's going to be playing a duelist, I believe, at that point. Go ahead and hit the next slide. Now, some of these things have a very unusual beginning. And I don't know if my friend Liz is here. I was hoping she would be here. Liz is here. Hello, Liz is here. I had a friend, and she had a friend back in high school named Grace Consacro. And Grace, back when I knew her, this would be about 1993, sent me an article about ghost stories. I still have the article all these years later about ghost stories in the Nashville vicinity. And I was reading this thing saying, oh, come on. I love ghost stories, but they're so spooky. They're always, and the history is the part that really bothers me. I hate the history because it's always so wrong. So when I read this article that says that in 1937, 4 teenagers were hacked to death with an axe at an abandoned summer camp in Cheatham County, and their ghosts are supposed to haunt the site to this day. I was like, really? So I do what a historian does, even in high school. I went down, I looked up the newspapers, nothing. I was like, that would have made the papers, come on, that would. So I go 10 years thinking, okay, well, there's nothing to it. I had to eat my words because whoever wrote that article knew their research. And they were only off by 1 year. Maybe that next slide. It was January 30th, 1938. The 4 young men were Carney Brizantine, age 25, Robert Williams, age 16, F.M. Simpkins, 22, and Bertrand Spicer, 18. They were killed with an axe and a shotgun. Their bodies were burned in a cabin on the property of Camp Dogwood in Cheatham County. That is the murder scene. That's the burned out cabin where they were killed. Whoever killed them set it on fire and burned it to the ground with the bodies still into it. Their death certificates, rather chillingly, even today, if you look them up, say, burned to a crisp as cause of death. I was like, God. They arrested 2 neighbors. In fact, this is Albert Davenport right here and Lee Nesbitt, 2 neighbors that live nearby. This story is one of the most twisted I encountered. I know I didn't do it complete justice in this book because nobody will ever know the true story. The Ridge guards its secrets well. This all happened on the Ridge, Maribone Creek in Cheatham County, just north of the city. It involves moonshine and people fooling around with other people's wives and all sorts of twisted things going on in that household. This was the household where where Davenport lived, and from whom the 4 victims actually departed that morning in a thunderstorm before they were caught and killed in this cabin a few hundred yards away. They were convicted, Davenport and Nesbitt were, for 99 years apiece in the state pen. Davenport died there in prison. Nesbitt actually was paroled years later and lived out apparently a very peaceful, quiet life where he was from. But it was these incredible human stories that came out. Again, Davenport is a hard guy to find any sympathy for. Even the sources I have, the people who are in the household seem to have been scared of him. Nesbitt's a strange fella because he's definitely in the moonshining and a bunch of bad stuff at that point. But that picture says it all. That's his son, and there's his daughter. And they said that the kids were interrupting the court the whole time while he was. His wife testified strongly for her husband that he couldn't have done this. And the whole time, these kids are running around and yelling, "Hey, Daddy," while he's on trial and trying to testify in his own life in defense of his own life. It's a weird story. I mean, Stephen King would be hard-pressed to write a scene like this and believe it. And so here's this story that I admittedly thought was completely nonsense. And it turns out to have an interesting postscript, too. I finally got to see the place. Grace, I think, wanted to go out there and go hunt ghosts. I have a friend who lives in Cheatham County. He said, when I said the Ridge in Narrowbone Creek, he was like, you don't want to knock on doors in that neighborhood. They guard their secrets well up there. And I finally got to see the site. Here it is. Camp Dogwood, as it turns out, is the first African-American summer camp in Nashville, African-American owned and operated. It was for underprivileged city kids to go have a summer experience. And the Depression killed it in the 1930s. But in 2003, they bulldozed the site, started clearing it, and tried to open it back up again. The Bethlehem Center actually still owns it to this day. So don't go trespassing, it's their property, don't go looking for ghosts. I assume when they cleared that, they finally, in 2003, cleared the murder scene in that old charred patch that the hunters, the ghost story was that the hunters didn't like to go out there at night because they'd see little figures darting from tree to tree up here and hear weird noises around the old burned, you could still see the pit where the cabin had stood. Don't know if that's true or not. I presume they bulldozed the ghost with the foundation. All I know is, that, again, the project fell dead and they didn't have enough money to complete it, and it's still privately owned but not operated to this day. But astounding story, here's Camp Dogwood, an amazing little fragment of Nashville's past that a lot of people don't even know about. I did certainly. Let's try the next one now. Let's see. Now there's the Sherlock factor, and this is where we're going to start clearing things up, finishing things up. Some of these stories are incredible because they start with nothing and you end up with this incredible picture. And this is one of my favorite. By the way, this is where what broke it open for me. These are the gates to Mount Ararat Cemetery, which is a crying shame. That is one of the gems of Nashville's history, and it's in awful shape. I mean, there was a bulldozer parked out here when I was taking pictures, and it looked like they were laying a water line through the middle of the cemetery. I was like, I hope you don't hit anybody while you're doing this. This was one of the first very prominent African-American cemeteries in Nashville, but it's long since closed, and it's in terrible disarray at this point. But it helped me break the case wide open. This case has to do with the Civil War. Years ago at the City Cemetery, I wrote a part for interpretation about the undertaker who worked there during the Civil War years, William R. Cornelius. In his memoirs, Cornelius was a very verbal guy, and he wrote an article called Embalming During the War, 1892, in which he makes this statement. I undertook the embalming myself with a colored assistant who became himself an expert and kept on at work embalming during the balance of the war and was very successful. The name of the colored man was Prince Greer, and he remained with me some time, but came in again to the city as a coachman. He died of poison, supposed to have been administered by his wife, but this was not certain. You want to strangle these people sometimes. It's like, what, when, where, who is the wife, what is... Well, for 10 years I had nothing to go on except that one brief statement. I was like, great, I'll never find out what happened to him. Well, turns out, I did find out what happened to him. I looked up the Ararat Cemetery records when they came on Ancestry. Lo and behold, thank you, miracle of miracles, he was buried under the name Prince Greer. Cause of death was prussic acid poisoning. And date of burial, November the 22nd, 1884. I have a date now. I was like, okay, well, maybe, possibly, there's a blurb in the paper about this weird thing. He's an African-American man, he's a coachman, it's a long shot. Boy, was I in for a shock. The Nashville World and the American, full-page stories. Popular coachman dies, possible poisoning in Nashville. They're running the entire coroner's inquest, verbatim, including Molly Graham, his wife, was testified. This was interesting. Molly was, you get a sense of a woman between two worlds there. She's a former slave too. She's only 20 odd years old to his 40. So, I mean, she was far younger than he was. But her neighbors testified she was white. The reporters thought she was white. Turns out, no, she was African American, but she was almost too white for that community and too African American for the white community. And everybody seems to be hostile toward Molly, probably for good reason, because Molly comes off, she herself said she could be a little fractious at times. She paints in her testimony a picture of a loving wife taking care of a husband. Turns out she had a screaming fit with him and said that, God damn you, I'll land you in hell by Saturday night. He died that day on Saturday. So, possibly not. She had an interesting postscript, too. She nearly died in jail when she was being questioned. She caught some fever, but they nursed her back to health and they gave her a job, the guys who nursed her back to health, at the, oh, there it goes. Could you, well, let's see. Yeah, backspace. There he is. One more. Gave her a job here at the city hospital as a cook. Yeah, it wasn't too long before Molly got into another argument with that doctor who saved her life and fixed spring peas, his favorite dish. He passed on the spring peas that day, so did his comrade. But the 6 people who did eat the spring peas, yeah, they had to roll up their sleeves and save their lives there on the dining room floor. She rather callously said, I think the peas were just sour. The doctors thought it was strychnine poisoning. As it turned out, they didn't have enough evidence, and once again, Molly walked free. So did we uncover a serial killer? Or at least, possibly, she poisoned 7 and maybe killed 1. Possibly. I don't know where she ended up. Maybe she narrowly poisoned somebody on another insane name. However, those are the sort of stories in the background that I've come up with on these stories. And I hope that I've whetted your appetite. If you'd like to, this is not a prerequisite, by the way. We're just going to go through all that. Oh, there it goes. Go back. That's my commercial. There you go. There's my commercial. This is my book, by the way, so if you'd like to purchase one, I've got them for sale here if you have time. If not, it's Amazon, all that. You'll see me at the Southern Festival of Books, I hope, everybody, on Sunday. I'm going to be there Sunday afternoon. So basically, it's a little overview of it. Hope I've whetted your appetite. If you have any brief questions, real quick. No? Well, then I think I'm going to turn it over to Jeff here.
Let's give Ryan a hand. I told you it was some good stuff, but I don't know. Now I kind of feel like I need to cleanse myself somehow. But anyway, it's a great book, Murder and Mayhem. Company's got copies. And thank you all for coming to our speaking series next month, Battle of Franklin. So come back. Thank y'all.